Good morning, Dr. Bangura.
Yes, sir. Prof. Harvey Kiani, it's so nice to meet you here and to have this conversation with you.
Great to connect with you. This is really exciting for me. Yeah. Been looking forward.
Yeah.
Before we go any further, let me give you a chance to introduce yourself to our viewers and our listeners.
Yeah, great. Thank you. My name is Bosco Bangura. I was born in Sierra Leone in West Africa. Somewhere in the 70s, and grew up there. Studied at Fourah College, where I did my MPhil, Master of Philosophy in Religious Studies, with a focus on teaching religious education in a pluralist context that was imagined from a war context, because Sierra Leone, has gone through a lot of battles. In the 90s, we had a terrible 11-year-old war, and that lasted a lot of lives. And incidentally, it was also during this time that I started teaching at the Theological College, the Evangelical College of Theology in Freetown, the capital, where I really served for 12 years as dean and then, of course, professor in African Pentecostalism and Missiology generally. And then from there, I moved on briefly to Ivory Coast, where I spent a few months. Moved on to Ghana also. I spent there a few months before coming to Belgium in 2010 for my doctoral studies. So I spent my time 3 years in Belgium, did my doctorate, and then worked briefly as an independent researcher amongst African migrant churches, reflecting upon religion and migration across the context of Africans in the West. And then from there, I taught briefly at the Uganda Christian University through their MA program, MA in Organizational Leadership. I was teaching one course, Culture, Ethnicity, and Diversity there before I moved over to South Africa to Northwest University, where I did my postdoc for 3 years. So that was 2015 to 2018. And in 2019, I came over to Hamburg, did graduate studies there. I did some research for 6 months at the Missions Academy at the University of Hamburg. And then finally, I am back in my home university in Leuven at the Evangelical Theological Faculty, where I do now serve as the senior researcher in Missiology. But of course, this is a joint position with the Protestant University in the Netherlands. So I work half of my time in Belgium and half of my time in Groningen, the Netherlands, on the same question. So you can imagine how much travel I have every week, meetings and so on. So basically that is it. I'm married. We have a son, Jonathan. I'm married to one wife and we have a son, Jonathan. And I also serve as associate pastor in a migrant church in Brussels and Antwerp. It's called World Communication Ministry. I've been with them now for quite a while. So in brief, that is me. I research on African Pentecostalism mainly, but religion and African migration, and then African Pentecostalism, both on the continent, as well as in the diaspora.
All right. So that gives me a lot of things to work with. Before we get to talking about your research, can I just ask what do you see happening in African Christianity in mainland Europe?
Well, of course, there are a whole lot of developments that are taking place amongst African migrants connected to African Christianity. I may hesitate to say it's a kind of revival because, you keep using the word again, revival again. But there are new developments that are taking place amongst African migrants in mainland Europe connected to their participation in faith. Europe, as we know, prides itself in defending and maintaining human rights. This means that they tend to emphasize secularization, in which religion tends to have a limited role in society. So the physical expression of religious symbols, signs and so on, offends the European public. And Africans are automatically thrust in this context, in this secular context, where God seems to be absent from the public discourse, but where they need to really connect with God in ways that are reminiscent of what they were used to when they were in Africa. And so they go into migrant churches, mainly Pentecostal churches, but also mainland churches, mainland Protestant churches that have also come up, like the Presbyterians in Antwerp, the city of Antwerp in Brussels, and in Belgium, sorry. They have Ghanaian Presbyterians, Cameroonian Presbyterians who go to this church and help to revive it. So I would say that we have seen a kind of bold assertion of who Africans are in terms of their relationship to the Christian faith, and they are willing to express it in spite of the secular context in which they find themselves here in Europe. So that would be my sort of small description of what I think African Christianity is.
And how is that working out?
Well, of course, this is working out in terms of the setting up of the churches that they really set up. So these are churches that are founded in disused factory buildings or shops that are not used anymore. Sometimes they also buy churches that have been closed, and they walk through it. But specific countries demand specific explanation. So let me be very specific here in Belgium. In Belgium, we have church networks that exist. And so some of these African migrant churches that have been founded seek membership in these established organizations so that they can receive recognition as missionary partners who work also here in Belgium. And of course, for some time, I was also part of them. I was given missionary credentials through one of these religious organizations, so that I'm able to perform in my capacity as a pastor. Also, some of them basically do so by going online. In fact, online now provides us with an opportunity to express themselves. So they have their programs online. And of course, given the context of the corona crisis and the church is closed, so religious services are immediately broadcasted online. And so they use these platforms to reach out to their following and to see how they can minister unto them pastorally and provide answers to the questions that they have. Others would also encourage their children to take religious education courses where they are provided in public schools. Sometimes the kids, second generation or born here, will say, well, what is the point of me taking a course in religion? They will say, you have to, you must take it. But of course, in our church, we try to explain to them that you need to engage with your children to help them see the relevance of religious courses. And yeah, events are also organized when it was possible before Corona. So events like musical concerts and so on, visiting evangelists who come in and preach, with miracles and so on. So it's a combination of activities that have been done, but slowly they are taking over. But of course, as these activities are done, sometimes they are confronted with restrictions. For instance, noise. They say they are too noisy, they're too loud, or you cannot distribute leaflets, religious leaflets. You have to seek permission from the city hall to be able to do so. All of these things restrict the expression, the self-expression of their Christian identity. But however, they are trying to do so in this context.
Wow. Okay. Final question before we go to your research. We're living in the context of what we call Black Lives Matter.
Yep.
At the moment. So the death of George Floyd.
Yep.
and many other things that have followed that. Is there anything happening in Belgium about this?
Yes, so I have had this question posed to me, and I've had some people also respond by saying that life for African immigrants is slightly much more at a better footing as compared to what is going on in the US, which I think I agree with generally, from a general perspective. We don't just hear of police killings of Africans and so on and so forth. But this doesn't mean that African migrants, particularly Black African migrants, are not also exposed to some form of institutionalized racism. I will cite just a few of those. For instance, most of the Africans struggle to find places to rent. Take, for instance, if they want a house, They will call in the phone, they will speak the language, but when they physically meet the landlord might simply say they decline. And even though the house is left empty, but because the guy looks African, he doesn't get access to it. So the housing market tends to be slightly closed. But there may be other instances of latent segregation, latent injustices that Africans do face here. Of course, because of the colonialization process between Belgium and Congo, this huge continent that was colonized by Belgium, and the king had, serious human rights violations and so on and so forth. So, but take that aside. Still, people generally tend to feel that if you apply for a job, if you apply for a house, if you want to access certain social services, your appearance makes it less likely for you to really receive those issues. And as a pastor working among African migrants, I hear this cry amongst my parishioners. I try to give them a positive outlook to what is going on. I try to tell them, well, probably you need to present yourself in a much more nicer way. You need to defend your integrity, establish your identity amongst them, and then they will take you to the next level. These happens, and so on. So I would want to say that, yes, George Floyd's death is unfortunate, but it has helped to pinpoint some of the issues that African migrants face in places like Belgium that were not in the public domain, but that have now been brought to the public domain so that policymakers, those who are responsible, can take the necessary adjustment of the legal climate so that Africans can also be who they are in this context.
And Belgium's history in the Congo is that well acknowledged in where you are?
Well, yes, of course. There is indeed just closer to my university here. We have the museum, the African Museum. It's called the African Museum. It's a huge institution that has all the artifacts from Africa and so on and so forth. And the aim was to showcase African art, culture, politics, and so on. But we know that it was also a means of perpetuating, perpetuating the colonial grip that the country had on DR Congo. I would say most people know about it, and particularly amongst evangelicals that I deal with at the university where I'm attached, they really deal with this past in a constructive way. How can we walk past the events that happen and try to make amends for it? Of course, there was a protest in Antwerp where the statue of King Leopold was torn down, and there are other protests in other cities, even here in Leuven. The city street, the name of a street was changed from King Leopold to Library Street. It was Leopoldstraat. Now it is Library Street, the street of a library, because the main university library is actually there. So all of these issues. So in fact, the George Floyd thing made it much more clear that Belgium had to confront its past in a constructive way, in an open and pluralist way. Because what is happening now here, it was suppressed before the George Floyd issue, but now it has been opened up. And I think that changes are bound to come. Changes are bound to come. And of course, my role as a senior researcher in the Department of Religious Studies and Missiology is also to bridge this chiasm. That it's not just a question of white Europeans teaching all the rest, but that amongst us there is one African, at least one for now. I hope we will be more. But we contribute to the discourse, So that's the consequence of the George Floyd issue.
Here in the UK, it's very clear from the data that people who have been largely affected by coronavirus are mostly Africans and other non-white British people. Is that the case in Belgium?
Well, I don't have the data per se, and so I hesitate to say what the statistics are. We have had something like 10,000 or so, 10,000 people about that who have died. And I don't yet know exactly amongst those who are from what ethnicities and so on. So I hesitate to make any claim here. But it is possible. It is possible that other ethnicities, I mean, blacks, Asians, and so on, who are basically connected to the service industry, the cleaning industry, the hospitals, and so on, they may be exposed to catching the disease, and therefore they may be susceptible, to die of it. But I don't have the data. I know that we have about 10,000 or so people who have.
I mean, in the UK here, it's been an issue. So the government had to conduct some research and release a report this last week or so. And it's clear in the report that it's mostly black and other ethnic minorities who have been really hit hard. All right. Okay. Thank you so much. This is helpful. Let's talk about your research. Where did you do it? Or what did you do it on? What was your research question?
Great. Like I said, I started my studies in Sierra Leone at Fourah. I did my MPhil there. And then came over to Belgium. First of all, I did the Master of Theology, second Master, 2005 to 7, and then I went back, continued teaching. 2010, I came to Leuven at the Evangelical Theological Faculty, the Theological University based in Leuven. That's where I came in 2010 and started my doctoral studies in Missiology with a specific research that was dear to me, because at that time in 2010, the movements of African Pentecostals, the Neo Pentecostals or Charismatic movement, as it was called, was a big business even before I left Sierra Leone to come and do the studies. So for 3 years, I was working on the theme of the Charismatic movement in Sierra Leone to analyze it, to analyze how it was founded, and to analyze its specific approach to 3 issues. How does the new charismatic Pentecostals approach issues of African culture? How do they approach or propagate issues of prosperity gospel? And how do they also display what is called power theology? So these were the 3 things that I sort of put into my dissertation. And under the question, how has this charismatic movement utilized both religious aspects, cultural aspects, and social aspect to contextualize Christianity so that the message they presented resonated with the people's needs in Sierra Leone back then? So the study was basically from 1980 to 2010. So that was my period in which I analyzed it to develop the history, to analyze what was going on, and to see how they reacted to issues of African culture, prosperity gospel, and power theology. In terms of my methodology, because it was basically in the field of mission studies, because it also had component of history, I had to do a collection of methodologies. For instance, I had to do a charismatic church survey. There was none existing before I started doing the research. Churches were existing, but there was no survey. So I did a survey. And this was done through my students at the Evangelical College of Theology. I gave them an assignment, and then we went to survey the old city of Freetown, and we came up with, in those days, around 400 different charismatic Pentecostal churches. I also had to do participant observation. I was present when these leaders of the 5 biggest churches were preaching. I did interviews with them, face interviews, email interviews, telephone interviews, and so on. Of course, I also access materials from their publications, so their sermons, their books, and so on. I access those charismatic literature to analyze specific conceptions of African theology, issues in culture, and so on. And then, of course, I also followed them online. This was the time when Facebook started. I followed them online, and now we have YouTube and all other means and so on to see what they were saying there. And of course, this was put in the context of analyzing the history of the church in Sierra Leone. Because up until this point, focus was only on the established denominations, and nothing was done about this movement. So I employed this collection of methodologies to really work on the thesis itself. And my findings, I mean, just one thing here. My findings were very interesting because it was clear that the movement was gaining grounds. It was gaining grounds, gaining followers, going into places, doing things, and so on. And the question was, their message resonated with the needs of African believers. For instance, they spoke about demons in ways that are consistent with African culture. They spoke about healing, disease, deliverance. They spoke about power, prosperity, and so on, in ways that resonated with the believers who followed this movement, and in ways that were not the case before the movements were founded. So here we see clearly that indeed the movement was gaining ground up to 20, and of course by now it's even bigger than I could even imagine. So it was gaining ground because it was connecting to the felt needs of the people who were flocking into these churches. So in brief, that was my studies. And of course, this was completed in 2013. The defense itself happened both in Leuven, but also it happened in Amsterdam, because this was a joint degree that I had to defend in both places and so on.
Can you share briefly about the story of Pentecostalism in Sierra Leone? And I'm asking that in the context of one, general Christianity in the country, but two, I would also want you to sort of reflect on just the history of Christianity in the country. It's with relation to its history, which of course then goes back to Britain and British colonialism. Can you do that in a few minutes?
Yeah, indeed. That's actually part of the findings that I made. And it deals here, this year specifically, with the context of how Christianity was founded. Sierra Leone, as you rightly pointed, was a British colony. A British colony founded basically to rid London of the problem of black people. This is the point. In the 1700s, James Somerset, a slave, ended up in a London court because he ran away from his Boston owner, and the Boston owner wanted to capture him back and send him back to the plantations and so on. But people who are connected to the Clapham sect, those who are British evangelical abolitionists, Gravel Sharp and so on, they gathered together, brought this matter in front of the judge in London to say, if somebody comes to London fleeing from slavery, they cannot be captured and sent back to the slave plantations. Lord Mansfield ruled in 1771 that, in fact, slavery was not part of English law. And this opened the door for many more slaves to escape the plantations in the US, and of course, again, after the American War of Independence, and they came to London. But it created a problem for the blacks, and they needed a place where they can integrate. The British government, on the recommendation of a botanist, found that Sierra Leone had a natural harbor in West Africa. It could take over these Africans. So they were sent there back in 1772. So this place was founded, the Province of Freedom, later on called Freetown. That is the name of the capital. It was founded for free slaves. But the slaves came already having exposed themselves to Christianity. So they came there, they sang that this was a liberation for them. They founded the churches and so on, but they were supported by the Church Missionary Society, CMS, who founded big churches, Fourah College, 1827, secondary schools and so on, education, hospitals and things like that. So Sierra Leone, in fact, according to Roger Olsen, one of the historians, he says Sierra Leone was the first Protestant missionary field in tropical Africa, apart from Southern Africa, because there already, from 1772, missionaries landed in Freetown. And there the church started. But interestingly, Christianity was basically confined amongst the liberated African slaves. The slaves who were brought, they were the Christians. They did not care to evangelize those in the interior. They did not care to share with them the gospel and so on. So this provided, although Sierra Leone had the kind of 200 years of missionary history, yet it provided a problem because it did not offer a Christianity to the indigenous people. Now, fast forward to my time of my study, let's say up to 1980. This was when I started my own studies, where the Pentecostalism story connects. By that time, 1980, Sierra Leone was already independent. The denominations that were connected to missionary organizations, the Anglicans, the Methodists, the Wesleyans from America, and so on, they had their churches, their schools, primary, secondary schools, and other institutions. They were implementing religious activities for young people, so youth camps during the summer. And they were teaching them to appreciate the Bible, to encounter scripture from a revivalist point of view. But when these guys went back, they could not encounter the same revivalist tendencies they had learned in school and in the camps, in their various churches. So by the 1980s, they started to move, and they started to found their own independent denominations. Of course, this was helped by other Pentecostal missionaries, particularly the AOG, that already started working in Sierra Leone around the late 50s and early 60s, and other movements, later movements that really helped to coalesce. So what we have today, what we have from then, was the formation of independent Pentecostal charismatic churches from the 1980s onwards. But also we had an effect of Pentecostalism in the mainline churches. So Anglicans, Methodists, Baptists, and so on, they also began to adopt Pentecostal tendencies. They also began to organize all-night prayers. They also began to organize deliverance sessions. They began to shout hallelujah in the preaching. They do praise and worship. So they still maintain their traditional names. They still have an affiliation with British denominations and so on, Methodists, Anglicans, and so on. But they have been affected by the Pentecostal fire. But that was not my own research. My research was basically about the movement itself, the Pentecostal movement, independent of the mainline denominations, and how they were successful, why they were successful, and what did they do, So here I would just point out to three implications that my study really provided, one of which I've already mentioned it, but this is the effect on African church historiography. If we look at Sierra Leone, for instance, like I've said, mainly the story of the church is told from the perspective of the mainline denominations, the mainline missionary organizations. Missionaries came, they planted the church grew. Well, this is true, but partly true. Let's put it like that. It was, in fact, Africans who were repatriated to Sierra Leone who founded the churches. But of course, they worked in collaboration with the missionaries. The missionaries provided the educational tools and so on. But the African agency is often minimized. And of course, you were aware of somebody like Samuel Ajay Crowder, the first black bishop who was trained at Fourah College but served in Sierra Leone before going to Nigeria. There's also another popular guy called Holy James Johnson. He was also trained from Sierra Leone, a liberated African, trained in Sierra Leone at grammar school and went to Fourah, became a missionary, also served in Ghana, in Nigeria, and also Gambia. So my study pinpointed the fact that, yes, there is a missionary factor in the founding of Christianity, but this should not exclude the African agency. And these charismatic Pentecostal churches founded from the 1980s are founded by Sierra Leoneans themselves, independent of any external influence. So this was a very serious consequence of my study. The second one, of course, it is also the question of this Pentecostal scholarship in West Africa. You would agree with me that when African Pentecostalism is discussed, your home country of Malawi, my home country of Sierra Leone, does not feature prominently. There's only Nigeria, there's only Ghana, there's only Kenya, there's only South Africa. These are the names that feature prominently, as if these guys determine what African Pentecostalism is. Well, I am not here to say that this is wrong. This is good because, you have a lot more people in Nigeria than in Sierra Leone. We're only 7 million, Nigeria 130 million or even more. But I think that Pentecostal scholarship in Africa, in order for it to represent exactly what Pentecostalism from an African perspective is, the voices, the dominant voices of Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, South Africa, those voices need to also dialogue with minority voices, voices from Sierra Leone, voices from other countries that may not have the population, but that may also have evidence of the presence of African Pentecostalism that is changing the context of African Christianity generally. So this was one of the things I engaged with, and this was one of the consequences. And of course, the last one, for which I'm now working here in Leuven, is Pentecostalism and its relationship to the African diaspora. Most of the African diaspora you meet in the West, in Europe, or in the East, in Asia, and so on. The likely possibility is that they are members of an African Pentecostal church. And this is a replica of what is happening from the home continent. So if somebody is a member of Pastor Alf Lukau's church in Hallelujah International in Johannesburg, and they are now living in Manila in Philippines, they may likely come together and form a church that reflects what goes on there. So there is an effect, there is an impact. Pentecostalism, African Pentecostalism, has been exported naturally amongst the African diaspora, and they are using those thought forms to really help them to adapt to the changing situation and integrate in the countries where they are. So if I put it in this context, then it was because of my sort of dissatisfaction with how African church history, Sierra Leone church history has been told. This is why I engaged in the story, to prove that yes, the missionaries did their work, but there was an African agent, and that African church historiography should pay attention to this. And of course, this leads me to West African scholarship on African Pentecostalism, and then its influence amongst the African diaspora.
Yeah, you have raised quite a few issues there.
Yep.
Let me try and unpack them one by one.
Yeah.
The writing of the story of African Pentecostalism.
Yep.
And the focus on Ghana, Nigeria,
yep.
Kenya, and South Africa. I mean, that's a very fair statement to make. But on the other hand, I don't know how to redeem this.
Yep.
But I look for materials on Malawian Pentecostalism written by Malawians. Yep. I can't really find any.
Yep.
Right? And these are my people. I know them. They are my friends. But they're not writing. Right? Zambia, it's our neighbor. I've been there a lot of times, and I know part of their Pentecostal scene. But they're not writing.
Yeah.
How do we help our people tell their story by encouraging them to write? How can we do that?
So I think that the way the story of African Christianity has been written affects the way African Christians themselves think about their faith and write about it. You mentioned examples. You would not be surprised that, in fact, the books that dominate, the books on African Pentecostalism from Africa that dominate are written by Western scholars. I mean, I don't have time to name them, but I'm sure you're aware of these ones. They are Western scholars.
Before you finish that one, let me tell you something. A friend of mine here in the UK just wrote a book about Nigerian Pentecostalism.
Yep.
White British friend.
Yep.
Teaching in London. The book came out just 2 weeks ago.
Oh, yeah.
It costs £120 here in the UK.
Yeah.
My Nigerian students here in the UK cannot afford the book.
At all.
But that book cannot be sold in Nigeria. Who is going to pay £120 for a book in Nigeria, right? And so it becomes a book about Nigerian Christianity that Nigerian Christians will not read at all.
Yeah.
Right. And that's part of the problem.
Yeah. Yeah, that is the downside of academia. Academia, we have to contend with. We have to contend with this again and again. Books are written by academic scholars from the West, priced at a very expensive cost that even African libraries would not be able to access it. But it is about Africa, and this becomes a dominant narrative. And I think that the few of us who are working in Western universities. We need to speak a bit louder. We need to raise our voice, not so much that we argue against of what is being done, but we raise our voice to allow the African voice to be present when issues of African Christianity are discussed. So this is one of the ways. The second way you mentioned is really the question of helping our African counterparts to really write things. I have the same frustration, when I think of Sierra Leone. I mean, we have minds, we have produced scholars, highly placed scholars, some of whom have impacted me personally, but all of us are based outside there. We try to inspire the guys on the ground. They don't find it interesting to write. So when they do at all, this needs serious editing and so on and so forth. So I think that the African church generally, African Christians and African Pentecostalism needs to really grapple with its own context from an intercultural perspective, reflect as Africans and think about what we do and write it down. By writing it, we provide an opportunity for people outside of our circles to be able to understand what goes on in our minds and how this relates to the faith. Because at the end of the day, theology is a response, is a response of humanity to God in the context where they are. And those who respond to God in an African context must be allowed, from an intercultural theological perspective, to contribute to a discourse describing what they do. This, of course, I'm sure internally, we need an external guide to be able to help us to see our rough edges, but we have a voice. We are the subject of study, and the subject of study must contribute into this discourse. And this is why I think people like Bukalu and so on, they have done us a favor to really set the pace. And we are working on their laurels and trying to build up what they have achieved.
Sure. That's great. You have also said something that I think needs to be sort of emphasized.
Yep.
It's the impact of the Pentecostal charismatic movement on mainline churches, mainline denominations in the continent. Can you say something more about this? Sure.
There's one Ghanaian scholar who have actually written a book, Cephas Omenyo. It is called Pentecost Outside of Pentecostalism. So he basically studied the influence of Pentecostalism on Ghanaian mainline churches, so Protestant, Methodist, Anglicans, and so on. How has Pentecostalism influenced their churches, their theologies, and so on? I think that this is an interesting study, which provides an opportunity for our students to really reflect upon it. Whilst much of what is said about Pentecostalism appears to be on the negative side, what is happening within mainline denominations is also Pentecostalism. In fact, it is even much more Pentecostal than it appears on the surface. But this is not spoken of because, we are Methodists, we are Anglicans, we are Baptists, we are Wesleyans, we are Mennonites, we are Lutherans, we are Calvinists, and so on. These titles take preeminence over issues that have to do with revival. But I think that for African Christianity, there is a connection, not just in terms of our intellect, what we think. Faith is not just basically reflection. Faith also has an affective aspect of it. It is what we practice, what we experience, how we live out our faith. And the reason why I think Pentecostalism has influenced mainline denominations is the fact that the churches themselves are beginning to be much more open to the movement of the Holy Spirit, to issues of healing, to issues of power, to issues of culture in ways that the missionary background of these churches did not do. And in this sense, if we begin to analyze it properly, we will see that a shift may be taking place. It may take some time before those denominations become fully Pentecostalized, but they are doing issues like this. I can tell you for free that, for instance, St. George's Cathedral in Freetown, the main church of the Anglican denomination in Sierra Leone, now have a segment of the worship service, the liturgy, called Praise and Worship. And there you have people playing 7 drums people praying on the acoustic and the synthesizer, accordion and so on, with the clergy, the dean of the cathedral, fully dressed with a cup on top and so on, but dancing for 15 to 20 minutes. And this happens in all the other major denominations. But yet it's still not Pentecostal. It's basically a renewal of the worship. But for me as a Pentecostal scholar, these are issues that we need to point to. That Pentecostalism is influencing the way mainline denomination do church and how this affects every one of us.
And now we have this African Pentecostalism, this African type of Pentecostalism that's finding its way to Belgium and to Britain and to Germany. How is it looking there? What's the reception like? What are the Europeans thinking and saying about African Pentecostalism, especially when it's there amidst?
This is basically why I'm employed here to try to correct it, to correct the perception that they have. But basically, it's a very negative perception, I would say. It's one that is full of noise, one that is full of fake healings, one that is full of fake miracles, and so on and so forth. It never actually shows the resilient part of African Pentecostalism in the West. By that I mean how the churches help people to adapt, to integrate, to survive the stress of displacement and the rigors of migration. It doesn't really address it, but this is what we do, So I think that scholars, both African scholars themselves, as well as European scholars, mainly from the social sciences, so anthropology, sociology, and so on, migration studies, they have spent enough time to analyze how these religious movements really help Africans integrate. And some of the findings have affected public policy, to a point that, when somebody needs integration and so on, people in faith communities can be called together and they can give an opinion in terms of what needs to be done and how this is to be addressed. But of course, the context of each of these countries determines how religion plays in the public sphere. For instance, in France, you have the laïcité. That means religion is not part of public life. You do your religion and that is it. In the Netherlands, religion is recognized, but it doesn't have any impact on public life also, but in a different circumstance. You still have the state church, the Protestant church in the Netherlands. That is if you're in the northern part. And then you have the Catholic church in the southern part. The same is true in Belgium. Religion does not play a role, but the state recognizes Roman Catholicism as the state religion. And Methodist, Anglicanism, and other faiths are recognized. So you find that in each of these circumstances, African Pentecostal leaders are to be aware of how to adapt, to how to access those leads so that their voices could become heard in the societies in which they live. I think some are not able to do that. Some are still struggling. They are opposing every, public policy and so on that is implemented by the state, but they're not accessing the means by which the state has set up to dialogue with religions. So we need to do so. In Germany, of course, Germany has its own states and so on, but Lutheranism is the state religion in some of the states. And there, they even have a department for migrant churches. They employ Africans. They employ others who are working in these areas. So I think that across Europe, I've only given 4 examples. So Germany, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. In others, it may be different, totally. Of course, in the UK where you are, it's also a different story. But I think African migrants themselves need to be aware of how to access these leads so that their presence can become official, and then they can make an impact slowly on society where they live. Because Africans have not come to go back tomorrow, they have come to stay. So they need to adapt to the secular context where they are.
Let me ask you the missions question.
Yes.
How are African Pentecostals evangelizing Europeans? Is that happening?
That is a very good question, Prof. I'm sure part of your academic life was spent on researching this question as to whether reverse mission, as we know it, is possible. Well, I would say this. I think that there has to be critical reflection on the part of us as Africans if we want to engage a secular Europe with the gospel. There has to be a critical reflection in various ways. First of all, to really be able to define who we are. Many of my African Pentecostal colleagues in Belgium are not able to even, well, I may be wrong, but I find that they find it difficult to construct their identity in a way that does not offend others. Okay. I will tell somebody that I believe in Jesus Christ, and they will say to me, Jesus is nonsense. There's nothing like Jesus. He did not exist, and so on. But I will still respond to him in a way that does not make him annoyed or make me angry. Yeah? In other words, I allow myself to be challenged by a non-believing context so that I am able to present the gospel to them. This is on a very academic level, but on a very practical level, the methods of evangelism that are common in Malawi, Zimbabwe, Uganda, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, they don't work here. You cannot just go to the main streets, put a loudspeaker and begin to speak loud and say you have to repent and so on. You cannot just go and say, these methods do not work. There has to be alternative ways of presenting the gospel. And this would be friendship evangelism, a very simple method that we all know of, friendship evangelism. How are we known by our neighbors? Do they respect us? Do they engage with us? Do we have any contacts? Do you accompany your children to the playground when they're going for football? Do you talk to the parents when you meet them there? What are the openings that you use to be able to present the gospel? Also, in terms of the church itself, when the church is organized, do you invite people to a church where everything you give them is basically African? Do you make the service a bit more open? Do you work on the noise levels? Do you work on the preaching? Is everything demonic? Do you have to cast and bind demons from the beginning of the service to the end? All of these things scare them away. So I believe that in a sense, the practical theological aspect of our worship services, they need to address the context in which we are in order for us to be able to administer to the needs of West Europeans. So I would say now, I don't think that we are making any mark. We're not making progress. We're trying, but we're not making the desired progress that we need. We need to be able to work on it. And lastly, I will point here that African migrants need to work on their children, to be able to help them to be sufficiently at home in the faith, so that these little ones begin to talk to their friends in schools or at universities, and their friends will be excited to visit our churches. And when they do come to our churches, the services should not cease to be African, but they should be open enough to allow alternative views to be present. So this is the range of options that I may present here.
Sure. And there's a question that I can't help but ask. Are the Africans in Belgium working together, as in Zimbabweans and Sierra Leoneans and Congolese and Nigerians and Kenyans? Are they working together, or are they all operating in their own small circles?
Yeah, I don't think that we are able to work together, partly because of the colonial legacies that we have had, the language barriers, French and English and so on, but also the ethnicities. People prefer to deal more with their ethnic groups than others and so on. But there may be more. There may be more. For instance, I would think that some people are basically afraid to have an ecumenism, an African ecumenism, which draws upon our Ubuntu philosophy, because they're afraid of losing their members. Sheep stealing is a big problem. If my church has only 17 adults, 10 of whom pay their tithes regularly, through which we are able to pay the bills of the church, and so on and so forth, I will be very hesitant to expose them to alternative thinking, and that may likely lead them away. So I don't think that there is a kind of cooperation. There are several initiatives that have been launched in Belgium to bring African churches together. For instance, the most recent one is called the African Caribbean Pastors Association. African Caribbean Pastors Association. It's an association that, as the name suggests, that brings together pastors of African descent and Caribbean descent together so that they can seek issues of common interest, encourage one another, and so on and so forth. But of course, I'm sure this is true also for the UK. Let me say 90% of the members of that organization are basically from Nigeria. And so automatically, when a Congolese walks in, when a Sierra Leonean like myself, I walk into that circumstance, I am immediately suspicious of the Nigerian domination and the direction that this thing takes. So for me, I think that the organization itself is really, it would be good for us to be together. It would be good for us to really work out things. But there are other difficulties that we have to deal with. And unless we deal with those issues, I think the African Ubuntu, which is represented in our African ecumenism, would not really yield the results that are supposed to be yielded here.
All right, okay. Thank you. I'm trying to land this now.
Yes.
The generation of African Christians coming behind us, so to speak.
Yep.
And their exposure to theological education.
Yep.
Would you have a word or two to just share with them?
Yeah. I think that first of all, they need to have a good grasp of what they want to do.
Sure.
In other words, if your interest into specializing in the New Testament, it has to be clarified from the very beginning that I'm going to be a New Testament scholar who specializes in the pastoral epistles, so Timothy and Titus, etc. They have to have that clear mindset. And like you've suggested, I think that our African preparation, theological preparation or university preparation does not really work on students at the undergraduate level to prepare them for a specific vocation. Some of them will still have, for instance, when they send in their applications at the master program that you organize or even here, and then you ask them, so what is your topic? What do you want to do? What is your research question? And things like that. It is not very clear. It's not often clear. So they need to have a good grasp of what they do. And I think that in terms of our engagements, we need to really push them to get to that point where they say, I want to specialize in New Testament with these things. Second, I would suggest they need to look for sympathetic professors. Let's put it like that. You and I, in the context of George Floyd, know that sometimes the guiding professor, your life pretty much depends upon him or her.
Sure.
And if he or she is not the sympathetic guy, you will be ruined forever. You will really end up having a kind of damage in your professional academic career. Sure. So they need to look for a sympathetic professor. A sympathetic professor in the sense, not that they agree with everything they say, but that they find room within their theological systems to fit you in and to help you define who you are in that particular context. So grasp of what they want to do, a good guiding professor. And a third thing I would suggest, we also need to have this next generation of African scholars to really be willing to do what I call theological ecumenism. I will try to explain it, what I mean by this view, theological ecumenism. I mean here that they need to be willing to cross from their own theological formations and background. If you have had training from a Methodist theological institute or a Pentecostal theological institute or a Baptist theological institute, and you come over to Europe to study theology or to the US or to Australia or to the West generally, be aware that your theological thinking, the presuppositions that you have, would be tested. They would be questioned. You would be tested in a very rigorous way. So when they come over here, they should not expect the kind of Christian theological training where the professor begins a class in pastoral theology with prayer. They don't even pray sometimes in these academic institutes, So they have to be willing to engage in theological ecumenism, cross over the aisle from their own theologies to somebody else, dialogue, encounter theological positions that are different. Even if they don't agree with it, they need to allow themselves to engage with it. And this will help us. This will help us in terms of our reflection. It will open doors and it will allow us to go to places we would never think of going, So these are my sort of suggestions for upcoming African scholars.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And finally, if somebody asked you to point them to 3 African theologians, maybe those that have helped shape you, maybe those that you find interesting and would need the world to be aware of, what 3 names would you mention?
I think, Prof, this is one of the most difficult ones you've given me because where do I go? What names do I give? You don't want me to be in trouble with some of them who are alive, who may listen to this broadcast. But anyway, I'll try my best.
Sure.
I'll try my best. I would sort of put it in 3 ways normally, using the three you have requested. I want to begin with Edward Fasciole-Luke.
Sure.
And he, not because he was from Sierra Leone, but because of the contribution he made in the 1960s, 1970s, when the definition of African theology, along with MPhil and others, was developing. Yeah. So Edward Fasciole-Luke studied at Fourah College. He was a churchman, but he was dean of the Faculty of Arts and professor of theology. And there he contributed an understanding of the definition of African theology. He says, our understanding of African theology, or our understanding of theology generally in Africa, has to be redeemed from the Western regalia that it was handed down to us in order for it to make sense to the context in which we practice it. So I think Edward Fasciole provided for me an opportunity to reflect theologically as an African, as a Christian, as a contextual theologian, what is it that faith does to me? So he would be one. Of course, this Edward Fasciole sort of represents the family of scholars behind him. So Kwame Bediako, John Mbiti, and so on. All of those, Peter Betek, Butolezi, all of those guys who contributed to the development of African theology. The second name I would mention, and this also affects what is going on now, is the name Bian Henry Kato. Of course, he is called the father of African evangelicalism. And this is for very good reasons, because in the 1970s, also when he was writing, Africa had the problem of whether the Christianity that was developing was a Christo-paganism or a biblical Christianity. So he called on the African church to do theology that takes the biblical text for what it is as the final revelation of God's word, which applies to the context of Africa. And of course, we know that through his work, the Association of Evangelicals in Africa did not only found Next, which is now a university, but also FATEB in Central Africa, which was the graduate school which is still the graduate school for French-speaking Africans, So he calls on the African church to think biblically. And if you think of the developments, both from Pentecostalism and other movements, the biblical depth of the African church is still something we would wish it would improve. And so I would refer to Bian Kato as one of them who inspires my thinking. And of course, since I am now working in the field of African Pentecostalism, or the African expressions of Pentecostalism, here I hesitate to mention one name because I will be in trouble with those who are still alive.
You can mention several.
But names like Okukalu, Lamin Sane, Matthews Odio, Alan Anderson, Kwame Bediako, Jehu Hansil, Sefa Zomenio, Kwabena Asamoah Jidu, Titi Tenu, Masi Odudoye, Esther Mombo. The names could go on. All of these scholars, as Africans, we need to read them. Not because we agree with what they do or what their theology is, but they are trailblazers. They did theology at a time when they had to fight to be present on the theological table. For us now, we are present on the theological table, but we are not using our presence in this table to impress upon our non-African colleagues what African theology should be like. So I think here, if we identify an aspect of theology and focus on one of these scholars, then we will be able to be much more competent in our contributions to the discourse of African Christianity generally and African theology in particular. So these are. I hope that I have not offended my colleagues, but anyway, of course, your name should have been mentioned. But
that was a really good one.
Yeah,
you did well. Anything else that you would want to share?
Well, of course, I mean, we have been in contact already with some initiatives that we are also trying to set up here. I hope that we would really promote our networking, so that you can be physically present on the site. I can also at some point in time be present somewhere else where you are, so that the more we are together, the more we begin to speak with that voice, the more I think our European colleagues will begin to understand that African Christianity is not the one that they inherited from, the colonial past. It's a post-colonial theological concept, So I think that our collaboration should continue. And please, I am open to, participate in sessions like this, but also I hope you are too when we also think of setting them up, and welcoming your contribution towards it. So thank you again for giving me this opportunity to speak to you and to have this dialogue over the last couple of minutes.
Really appreciate this. Thank you so much.